Welcome to this first online conference organised by the United Reformed Churches Buildings Forum. My name is David Tatum. I am a retired URC minister and one of the 4 members of the organising group for the conference. The others are David Skip, the property officer for Thames North Synod, Cliff Patton, who is an architect and an elder in one of our churches, and Steve Summers, who is responsible for our church-related community workers and special category ministers. And that in itself, I think, already helps to broaden the background of the forum, which was established a few years ago now as the result of a series of roadshows that were jointly held with the Methodist Church. And it was established under the purview of the Mission Committee and with representatives from the Synods. Its purpose has always been not just to deal with issues of bricks and mortar, but to include the missional dimension of the church's life, the way in which we construct and use our buildings, and even to venture into the territory of asking whether a building is always necessary or even helpful. We've attempted to reflect all of this on the forum website, and with the increased use of Zoom during the lockdown and the questions that has raised for us about our buildings, it seemed a good time to organise this conference. We intend it to become the first of many which will focus on a wide range of the different issues that are important and encourage a sharing of information, of stories, good practice and creative ideas. We welcome visitors to this conference from other groups and other traditions. And although it's essentially a URC focused event, we hope that both the lessons that we can learn from one another and what we can share together will benefit us all. And of course, most importantly, contribute to the work of the gospel. So alongside our keynote address from our General Secretary, John Bradbury, and input from one of our churches at Mill Hill East, we're very glad to have input also from Heart Edge, the initiative that has sprung from St. Martin in the Fields. Those will be the 3 main pieces of prepared input, but equally important is the input that will come from you. So the questions that you will bring and ask through the breakout rooms that will be organised towards the end of the meeting. We're delighted that there are over 250 attendees to this conference, but that clearly means that only a small number of the questions that you have can be answered, but they will be collected, and the intention is that they will become visible through the reporting of the conference and will contribute to our planning of future events. Some may be answered via the website and by other means. We're also very glad that the conference is being hosted by Simon Peters. Simon, as most of you will know, is the project manager of Walking the Way, which is the URC's focus on whole life discipleship. So we're particularly pleased to be connected with that, to have his support, for which we're very grateful. Finally, as I'm sure you know, all of this wonderful technology is not beyond going pear-shaped. And although we have put various plan Bs in place, if something goes wrong, that is no guarantee. So we hope you will bear with us, and also hope that you will find this meeting of use and a source of encouragement. So without further ado, I invite John Bradbury to speak to us.
I begin with some words from Scripture from 1 Peter. Come to him, a living stone, though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight, And like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Christ. The epistle writer uses a metaphor of a building for the church. The church, of course, is not a building. It is its people bound together as more than the sum total of the individuals, the body of Christ, the people of God, the event of the act of the Holy Spirit. And of course, we're very, very used to the mantra, the church is the people, not the building. We lose sight of it at our peril. Some of our most exciting churches in the United Reformed Church don't have their own building. They meet in borrowed spaces to worship, witness, and serve. I suspect we have many congregations within the URC who might possibly be better off without a building. But of course, we do get so attached to our buildings, don't we? So buildings are always secondary to the community of the church and the communities within which congregations are situated. In fact, the whole Reformed tradition can be a little sceptical of buildings, for they tempt us too easily rather to idolatry, and I fear we do idolize some of our buildings, however unadorned at times. Or alternatively, they can tempt us to lock God up in them. Not, of course, that that's ever very successful, but it is not for nothing that Calvin locked the doors of the church in Geneva outside the times of public worship. He did not wish to encourage the thought that you had to be in a church building to pray, rather than praying wherever one was in daily life. Creation is the theatre of God's glory. For that reason, the Reformed tradition is deeply sceptical of any kind of sacred secular divide. We don't consecrate our buildings. They are no more sacred than our homes or public spaces. All of which might seem not a terribly upbeat beginning to a talk about church buildings. It is vital, though, that buildings do not make the church. But at the same time, they are one of the most amazing resources that we have. Our forebears in the faith have bequeathed us a rich inheritance in terms of our buildings. How we steward them is a matter of how we exercise our lives of discipleship. And those who come after us may well judge us on the basis of what vision we have had for our buildings now. I often think that there are 4 dimensions to the life of the church: its worship, its witness, its service, and its evangelism. And our buildings can be the most fantastic resource in enabling all of that. But more than that, buildings also shape the communities that live within them. It was Winston Churchill who famously said, "We shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us." In the pastorate that I was serving until recently, part of that ministry was working with 2 congregations who had united to form one new church in the city centre of Cambridge. One building was sold, the other entirely redeveloped. The work is just coming to conclusion now. The architects we were working with, who specialise in church buildings, Archangel, were very keen to help us see the building as that which was shaped by our sense of vocation to worship, witness, service, and evangelism. For the building would then shape us in those things in years to come. The building we inherited was remarkable for its sheer size and its location. It had been well tended and was a remarkable gift from those who had gone before us. But it was a building of sheer stone walls straight onto the street. It was a building you could not see into at all. The sanctuary and the halls were separated by a dark, dingy corridor. It embodied a sense of the sacred secular divide between the sanctuary and the halls, something we have, as with so much, to thank the Victorians for. In a memorable church meeting, which raised a few eyebrows to say the least, the architect said, looking at our beloved building, "It might as well be called St. Buggeroff's. for how inviting it looks. £5 million later, the place is transformed. Large windows allow one to see in and through the building from the street. A glass entrance invites that transition from outside to in. The flow around the building now makes for easy transitions between all the available spaces. Gone are the two large Victorian halls, replaced with one good-sized hall and a series of small meeting rooms. One of our partners, a group therapy centre, now has purpose-designed space. The sanctuary can be multi-purpose, and so on. All after a remarkable work from the buildings group of the church, the architects, the contractors, who have worked together in the most extraordinary positive working relationship, which, for those interested in such things, we concluded was wonderfully aided by a single contractor open book tendering process, which inculcated a relationship of positive trust right from the outset, rather than competition. But it also all came after a remarkable amount of reflection on what we were called to do and be in terms of our worship, witness, service, and evangelism. Our vision of being a community of communities which united differing worship communities, different pieces of evangelism and service that sought to reach out to the multi-layered and often quite disparate communities of the city centre. A plan for pioneer ministry within the nightlife of the city in which we were slap bang in the middle of, and so on. The building will now, I pray, shape the community of Downing Place Church as it responds to that vocation. Part of our vision was to be a piece of public space within the city that was accessible to those who are often denied access to public space. Cambridge is a city noted both for its wealth and also the radical divide between rich and poor. The city centre was becoming the playground of the rich and also the literal home of the street homeless. But a large hinterland of Cambridge society has effectively lost touch with its city centre. Going back many years to when I ministered in Liverpool, when the city centre was undergoing a massive redevelopment, the same phenomena was happening. Folk from the inner city congregation I served felt totally disconnected from the city centre that had always been their city. At the same time, in the inner city, shared public space was disappearing rapidly. Shops shut, post offices closed, even the pubs closed. Spaces in which pre-COVID and as life is meant to be and will be again, where people rub shoulder by shoulder in community, those spaces were rapidly disappearing. Church buildings provide a remarkable opportunity for shaping a bit of public shared space in the heart of communities up and down the land. If we can resist the urge to turn them into sanctuaries of the sacred, they can help us to manifest the reality that the whole of creation is indeed the theatre of God's glory. They allow us to witness to the reality that Christ's life, death, and resurrection is indeed for all, that God wills the flourishing of all human beings and calls us as God's people to witness to that hope and reality. So, where is the URC at the moment on the question of buildings? Well, that's a good question, and one we need to ponder with care as we begin to review our church life in the way that Mission Council asked for at its last meeting. Talk of a URC strategy for buildings is extremely difficult. We are by no means without resources. We probably have around 1,200 church buildings. That might well be more than we need. The assets that we sit on as a result of the sale of church buildings are not inconsiderable. In the 5-year period to 2018, I've not done the sum since then, it's on the to-do list, but I've not got there yet. The cash assets of our synods had risen from 100 to 150 million. So we've got the land, the buildings, we're not totally without money, but of course each building is held in trust for the purposes of one congregation, and each congregation rightly in our tradition, has a great deal of autonomy over the management of that building. Other buildings are held largely in 13 different synod trust companies. Sorry, our buildings, not other buildings. Our local church buildings are held largely in 13 different trust companies, some of which, courtesy of property values in their part of the country, sit on very large assets. Others sit on almost nothing. The United Reformed Church Trust itself owns very little property: church house, moderators and church house ministers' manses. That's about it. Many synods struggle with the human resources to mount genuinely ground-breaking building strategies. And no synod has the authority over church buildings to do anything much more than nudge, and the General Assembly is yet further removed from being able to do anything much more than nudge. And I say all of that not to be despondent, but to point out in part, as perhaps a General Secretary must, that considering matters of our structures, our resources, where they are, how they are best organised, so that they can be stewarded to best serve the worship, witness, service and evangelism of our local congregations, is actually vitally important to our ability to do exciting things on the front line of church life in communities up and down the country. That kind of reform is not, I would suggest, fiddling while Rome burns. If we turn our backs on that kind of difficult reform of our structures and our assets, we will fail in faithfulness, I believe. Clearly, life after this pandemic is not going to be as it was before. Some synods are estimating that between 30 and 50% of their congregations may well close in the next couple of years. Many simply will not reopen. Decline as we've lived with it for a long time, and a quick survey of the hair colour at any URC event will tell you that pure demographics mean that this is not going to change quickly. But in the midst of all of that, there are possibilities. What if, just to dream a wild and possibly totally unrealistic dream for a moment, but what if in 10 years' time we did not have 1,200 buildings anymore, but 600? What if some congregations saw that they might well release themselves from the burden of impossible buildings and engage in their worship, witness, service and evangelism best in borrowed spaces or as house churches? What if some, as the congregations in Cambridge caught the vision to do, merge, preferably before they absolutely have to, and whilst they've still got some life to make something of it? If we take the URC over as a whole, released the capital from 600 buildings, what, I wonder, might we do with it? What new places might we be able to initiate congregations and buildings, perhaps in places where public space has increasingly disappeared and where people feel marginalized from their own localities? What if we were able to effectively church plant into places where we have buildings, but very few members of congregations to make those buildings flourish at the heart of their communities? What if, instead of 1,200 buildings, many much loved, but a bit crumbly around the edges and perhaps no longer serving the needs of their communities, we had 600 buildings that were redeveloped to be up to date environmentally at the highest standards, so that we do our bit to get to 0% emissions, and that these were places and spaces of hope and renewed life, were places and spaces that indeed shaped the communities they were home to be vibrant and flourishing in their worship, witness, service, and evangelism. Just what might that look like? Just might, perhaps, something as mad as this, in the power of the Holy Spirit, be our vocation? It would take lots of boring constitutional amendments, complicated conversations with trusts and charity commissions, and who knows, possibly even an act of parliament. But if we could end up in a place like that, might it just possibly be what faithfulness to God's call to be the church for the mid-21st century looks like. I will be fascinated to hear what conversation we have as the rest of the afternoon unfolds. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you. That's a very challenging and fascinating set of images, not just one image, but set of images, I think. Much for us to chew over, but I think many people have chewed over these things in the over the long period of time, one way and another. And we've had a couple of questions that have come in, and a few other questions that were presented before. I'm going to try and weave one or two of them together. One question was talking about the need to perhaps employ an administrator or project manager in order to make the best use of facilities. Another practical one about getting outside agency in, so we're talking about partnership. I think those two kind of fit together. Question that we already had was an interesting one, and I think it's was picking up on the 600 church model that you're suggesting, which said, do you think there is a danger that the 600 churches that close would more likely be in poorer neighborhoods, when as a church that's exactly where we should be present and engaged? If so, do you think it's important to target resources into poorer areas? And there was another question about resource sharing across the synods. So it seems to me that there's a question kind of emerging out of those, which links with much of what what you've said already, which is about what kind of roadmap. We're talking about roadmaps out of the pandemic. What kind of roadmap can you see so that in 10 years' time we might reach something like the kind of place that you've picture that you've painted for us?
Thank you. Lots of interesting points there. When one flies a kite and paints possibly a kind of picture of a vision, it doesn't come with a set of steps and stages as a roadmap, and one would certainly need to think very carefully about that. And of course, we'd need quite a careful conversation as a whole denomination as to whether indeed that was the kind of vision that we thought we were moving towards. But I do think that there are things that we can do to make it easier to take some difficult decisions and move certain things forwards in some of these areas. I think we do have to address quite carefully the realities of resource sharing between synods. We have ended up in a situation that seems to me fairly unsustainable in terms of, I suppose, unexpected consequences of the way things like the schedules to the Act of Parliament were drafted, and then what's happened as district councils disappeared and so on. That, you know, some bits of the country have ended up extremely wealthy on the back of property, and other bits of the country are left with very little. And we do need, I think, a very serious URC-wide conversation about that. And I think there are also questions about whether we can sensibly steward the resources we've got, whilst a lot of those resources are kept in separate little pots, which makes it very hard to know what overall we've got. Nobody has an overview of it. You know, it's very hard even to know exactly what we've got, as it were, never mind what we might do with it. I think there's also some questions about, you know, joining up different sorts of resources. So things like our special category ministry scheme, it obviously sits with the General Assembly, and synods may well make bids for it. But our ministry resources are in that sense stewarded at General Assembly level. Our buildings resources tend to be stewarded at synod level, and I'm not always sure that leads to the greatest amount of joined up thinking about how one might do new things and so on. I think the question about, you know, would churches that close end up in poorer areas. I mean, that has been our lived reality. That's what we've done. And I think we've done it largely by letting the kind of market forces rule, and the weakest go to the wall, and the weakest churches tend to be in some of the most deprived areas. So when I was in Liverpool, there were 6 churches in a ring in the inner city. I think there is now only one of those churches left. We have just retreated in that city from some of its most deprived areas. And that's where I think, if we're going to use some of the resources that are released through the sale of buildings, we need to be much more intentional about trying to engage in parts of the country where we have withdrawn, often almost inadvertently as a denomination, just because that's the way things on the ground have worked out. And I think we would need to be very intentional about that. But that, of course, requires partnership working. It requires a lot of trust between local communities, synods, the wider General Assembly level of the church, and so on. And without those relationships and that level of trust, we will tend to get stuck.
Yes. I mean, another question, I think, which links with that, and perhaps it connects also with the comment that you made about the fact that we have, 13 trusts, structures in the synods, and we have a legal structure. We also have an ecclesiology, which we've inherited. And I just wonder what you think about changes in our ecclesiology that we might need to adopt in order to make this kind of thing possible.
I mean, I sense that some of the kind of legal structures are the trickier things that bind us at the minute, because that is about where our resources end up, which is actually a different question from our ecclesiology. An awful lot of the decision making about where new pieces of work are initiated and where they're not sits at the moment with synods, and clearly I think it's got to sit fairly close to the ground, or one ends up not aware of the communities that one is engaging with. But of course that means that the possibilities for synods engaging in that kind of church extension work, as it were, mission work, church planting, pioneer work on the ground, varies quite considerably according to whether you're a synod with a lot of money or a little bit of money. And I do think that at that point, there might well be a case for saying, well, we need, as a whole United Reformed Church, to take some decisions about where we're going to operate and where we're not, where we're going to start new things and where we're not. And that's also partly possibly a reality that, yes, we've got resource. I think we've got more resource than we often like to think we have. We haven't got endless resource. We might not be able to do something like that 13 times over in every synod. But if we were to take decisions collectively and together, we might be able to do that in 6 or 7 places, and that actually could make a radical difference to 6 or 7 communities on the ground. It could in time make a radical difference to the United Reformed Church. I think an awful lot of that is already in our ecclesiology. I think sometimes we fight shy of some of the authority that synods at times have to do things, or indeed stop doing things, because we're a little bit out of the habit at times of using some of the authority that synods have, as we think of ourselves as much more purely congregationalist. Well, we are, but not totally by any stretch of the imagination. I think there's already stuff in our ecclesiology that we can draw on more than perhaps at times we do.
Thank you. We might have time for one more. I don't know whether this connects. One that's just popped up on the chat that says, would it be helpful if we have a vision for our buildings in relation to church growth than just being reactionary and managers of decline, as I believe is the position we have taken as a denomination? What are your thoughts?
I actually think it's a false dichotomy, the managing decline and planning for growth thing. Actually, there's a big bit of me thinks people say we spend all our time managing decline and we never plan for growth. I'm not sure we really are managing our decline. I think we're kind of, by and large, just letting it happen. And I think it's precisely about saying, actually, there are places where God's mission in that place, in the form it's been, has come to an end, and we give thanks for that work, and resources at that point are released, which allows new things to happen elsewhere. And I'm not sure that we are as deliberate as perhaps we might be about saying, if we work very carefully to bring a good end, because we all know the difference between a good end for a local worshipping community and a bad one can be huge in terms of its impact on individual church members and their lives of discipleship. But where we do that well, and then intentionally think, well, how do we use the resources that are released from this to begin new pieces of work? Death and resurrection in the Christian tradition belong together, and our decline and the seeds of new growth, I think, also belong together. And I think we need to become much more alert and aware of the fact that these are flip sides of the same coin.
Yeah. Good. Thank you. Well, John is going to be with us for most of the rest of the conference, and there is another plenary discussion or question and answer time a little bit later on. So it may be that more questions will come in that can also be fed in there, and there will be others who will be answering questions too a bit later. But we're going to move on. I said at the beginning that we were very pleased to have folk from the Heart Edge initiative from St. Martin in the Fields. And we're going to have some input now. And Andy Turner is going to, I'm not sure whether he's going to introduce it or simply play something, but I'm going to hand over to Andy from Heart Edge.
Great, thanks so much. Good to be with you this afternoon. I am Andy, and I work as part of Heart Edge. And I'm going to just share my screen so I can bring up a little slideshow, and we'll just go through this. Heart Edge is an ecumenical movement. It's got about 700 members, set up in 2017. And it is in all sorts of countries now, doing all kinds of things, focused around 4 areas: development of commercial activity, and buildings play a big part of that, which is maybe why I'm here this afternoon. It's also engaged in looking at how we can develop our cultural activity and our compassion, linking in with communities and what's happening locally on the doorstep. And finally, it's all rooted in the congregation. And it's ecumenical, so we work with lots of different church denominations and groups around the UK and around the world, and it's grown out of the work of St. Martin in the Fields. We've got a steering group. The URC are involved in that through the wonderful Marie Trubick. I don't know if Marie's on the call, but anyway, Marie brings a lot, and we're working to connect in with brilliant things that the URC does, like church-related community workers, which is extraordinary. And so people like Noel Irwin and folk at the Northern College, we're hatching a plot to signpost more and more people to things like church-related community workers. Okay, let's start. I'll just maybe the numbers betray the fact that buildings are a big deal, and they're also quite scary. They're like a bit of a monster, and they raise, in our experience, in our work, particularly when we talk about church buildings and commercial activity, how you can maximize your church building. There's questions about how you change that crumbling, flaky old building from a risk that's a headache and a worry, consuming and eating time and anxiety, making me wake up at 3 a.m. How do you turn that into an asset? How would you turn that into something that's useful and going to generate support? There are lots of other questions here, which are part of what we pick up in our work with churches and congregations as we look at issues like money and how we grow money, how we develop our mission. And the two are often tied up quite closely. How do we avoid what I'd call the fire sale of a building to fund maybe short-term revenue that provides for a worker in the short term, But when that money runs out and the worker goes, where's our sustained presence? How do we nurture our own community, our own congregation? Maybe this is about imagining alternatives, or where do we start with that? How do we create new stories at the edge? Heart Edge is about being at the heart of culture and a sense that God is there, working in our communities, but prioritizing and present at the edge, at those communities that write themselves off very well, thank you very much. Those communities that are in the margins, maybe where you're based this afternoon, maybe not, but we can think of those kind of areas and communities. And finally, there's a question here about how do we enable buildings to subvert the benefactor model? The model of the big donors in the church maybe, or those that take up some of the power and give us money and therefore have a louder voice. Is there a way of enabling a building to generate income which can subvert that kind of dying model maybe? I don't have any benefactors. Be nice to have a few maybe. How do buildings enable us to sustain a presence at the edge? Heart Edge is about trying to understand some of the opportunities that buildings present. And there was a picture on that last screen of Bromley by Bow, and here's the Levenshulme project in Inspire, which you'll maybe be familiar with. Great stories. And when we're talking about, you know, money and income and building it, we've got a couple of models here. One where the building is instrumental, really. You know, where we might use the church building to generate some trading impact with no real social impact. It's not really connected to our mission, but we will generate some surplus from hiring out the hall space. Or we'll have little office units in there or something or other that don't particularly connect into social impact, but they do maybe enable us to help sustain paying for the building, maybe fund the youth worker or a post in the church of somebody working in the congregation, or maybe help us to do some project work. We see buildings being used in a very instrumental way. Another way is what we'd call the exemplary way, where there's trading activity with no social impact, if you like, but it's working to pay a good wage. It's working to generate a good, you know, environmental footprint, if you like. And, you know, we're looking at fair trade practices and others that enable us to generate some income and to enable us to fund some of the work that we're doing. So there are two different models that we often see, the instrumental and the exemplary, that enable buildings to contribute to enabling that presence to continue, particularly in poor areas. And Inspire is a cracking example of some of that, but particularly where it's got to focus in on social. And that's where you'll have stories around the Bromley by Bow Centre and Inspire that are real, you know, I suppose, jewels in the crown a little bit of what the URC have developed over the years, where there's trading activity and it's linked directly into social impact. And so you're developing you know, you're kind of got that balance between mission and money. Heart Edge has come out of the work of St Martin the Fields, the vicar there, theologian, broadcaster Sam Wells. You may have come across Sam. One of his conditions is that he writes books. They just keep coming out all the time. And here's a quote from a recent book called A Future Bigger Than the Past. If you want to know about what Heart Edge is about and some of the theology that undergirds that, then pick up a copy of A Future Bigger Than the Past, and it will give you a theology of the work that we're doing, particularly around an area like commercial activity, which some of us will feel uneasy about. Here's a quote, see what you think about church buildings. Places that are encounters for the whole neighborhood. The voluntary sector is crying out for funding, and one of the areas in the last 20 years they've been lobbying local authorities is asset transfer. We would like a public building. We can run it better and we can use it to generate revenue. The URC, along with other denominations, are sat on asset resources. And our approach is to say there's a real priority that can be about advancing abundant life locally, where, yes, there's worshipful activity that happens, but there's also that connection and engagement with the community. That's a real priority. How do we get to that? Here's an example. It's a tricky one. I picked this one up because it's a monster of a building in rural Cornwall. And this is the quote from the local bishop, former bishop of Truro. See what you make of this. He's talking about the feeling that you might have as pastor when you get given the keys to the building. Something you didn't maybe pick up any training about when you were at college and you were training as to be a pastor. And you suddenly feel this incredible weight of responsibility for a monster of a building that you've now got to look after. And Tim Thornton refers to this as some kind of, burden. And he's saying, actually, we've got to break out of this. And one way is to say, actually, these church buildings have always been the responsibility, certainly within the Church of England's position, there's been a responsibility of the parish, of the wider community that hold it corporately. But often there's an internal pressure on the incumbent. I've somehow got to sort this out. I've got to deal with it. And Thornton says, instead of trying to break out and try something new, okay, so maybe there is a community responsibility and we could hold this corporately. They say if it's going to go wrong because of so many risks, it's not going wrong on my watch. And so we become risk averse and controlling. Buildings present a huge challenge for us, in terms of what we do and where we develop our work and how we prioritize our resource. Thornton chucks down a challenge, which is to say, actually, some of the opportunities, some of the assets, some of the support is out there in the wider community. And his challenge for a rural diocese was to say to congregations like St. Germans, you need to work with local villages. You need to work with those in the community who have a loyalty and attachment to the building, or who may have a vision for using it in some way, developing it in some way as a resource. How did St. Germans look at the options they had presented to them? One was to just close, turn it into a place of a heritage project that would open a couple of times a year. The other idea they had was a development trust, something that would be independent, autonomous, that retained a worship space that would be useful for services and could be prioritized for those activities, but also be developed with the involvement of the wider community, local villages, a university up the road in Plymouth, into arts, education, maybe a venue. So they had a choice and a challenge. And there were some of the issues, some of the obstacles that came up might be of useful to you on the call here, maybe. Buildings were clearly a source of huge frustration for the PCC, for the local, for the eldership, if you like. But there was also a reluctance to innovate. Presented with the challenge, there was anxiety and a sense of how do we move forward on this? And when ideas were presented, there was caution and reluctance. What else? There was a culture of isolation. We don't want to engage in the neighborhood, in the local community. We want to work for them, but we're reluctant to work with them. We don't want to share the resource. We want to go it alone, even though our resource locally is diminishing. If we do anything, we do it for, we don't work with. And finally, there were questions about the institution. Some of them were trying to get funding from local and central government, from Heritage Lottery. Actually, the opposition and the inertia wasn't coming from central government, from the local council, from Heritage Lottery. It was coming from the institution itself that was saying, actually, you need to shut, or you don't, we don't have the capacity. We could go this afternoon to St. Paul's Old Ford. If you go to the Heart Edge website, you can read a case study about their work. The anxiety of the local Church of England diocese to close down a building that's now a lively arts centre, community centre, cafe, gym, and other activities that are going on. We could find Philippa Boardman and talk to Philippa about some of the issues and challenges that she faced from the local institution. There's something here about imagination and trying to find ways through. And there's also practical issues like governance. For St. Germans, they had to think through about a shift in their governance model that would free up the eldership to focus on mission and people rather than the buildings, the drains, the toilets, the roof, the dry rot, to share the weight of this with the community. And to work that out through a lease agreement that would give them absolute freedom to do what they needed to do, alongside sharing the weight of responsibility with interested local people. It's one particular model. What does it throw up? It throws up a couple of questions that might be relevant to you on the call. Who controls the assets? Whose agenda is it, if you like? It might be it's the congregation. And maybe as a congregation, you're needing to look at new skills and resources to maximize the asset, if you like, that building of yours, and to somehow turn it into something that could generate some revenue. So it throws up challenges, questions for you as a congregation. But there's also something here about the community, about the congregation needing to find ways to engage, to build relationships, to develop partnership and trust. Now, some of these, you've got loads of stories about where you're doing that. You're on it, you're doing it. Talk to Marie, I hear from her, and there are others who are, you know, we've got Joe Walker on the call. We could talk to Joe and about the work at the Round Chapel in Clapton. I guess the question is, the question I'm always interested in, and we're always interested in at Heart Edge, is where are the new stories? The stories from the last 5 years, the last 5 months, the last, in the challenging context where we're in, where are the stories of work that's being led locally? Where there are new stories about how church buildings are enabling us to maintain a presence in the margin, in those edgy little areas where God is working. How are you resourcing as well this massive opportunity that you've got? How many buildings around about? Quite a few. And maybe a huge shift that you need to now consider. How are you as a denomination, how are you as a church resourcing the management of this huge shift? Very quickly, and I'm going to finish, there's a few things here about Heart Edge. Our conviction is that God gives us all we need. In exile, we have it. It's all there. In a community, there are local assets. Sometimes we need to turn around the culture locally, the culture of us as a church. Maybe where instead of seeing assets and abundance, we just see deficits and deficiency. And we can't see the assets and the abundance that might be in our congregation and are most certainly in our community. That's about a different way of thinking and seeing. Heart Edge can help to shift the culture, if you like. I'm sure you're doing, and there are stories of that within the URC. And finally, the church might be feeling like it's getting smaller, like it's getting narrower. We believe that churches are about being lively and dynamic communities, not defensive or narrow congregations. So we work with congregations where we're at, and we work to engage and connect in with the wider community. Heart Edge focus on those 4 C's, and you might be a church that's doing 1 or 2 of these, but we believe it's the interplay, between all 4 that we see the church developing all kinds of stories. Okay, here's a little quote there about the Holy Spirit. We believe we're about moving beyond the conventional notion of church, I guess, by being open to the partnership with what the Spirit is doing in the world. So partnership is really key here in terms of how we believe churches can work. How do we support that? Heart Edge has a network of communities and churches where we put each other in touch. Oh, sorry about that. Where we can mentor one another and provide support, where there's opportunities for consultancy over Zoom and through meeting up. We're just recruiting a couple of posts to do with commercial activity and generating business. And so there might be an interest that you have as a congregation in accessing some support, some consultancy. I've put the details about Heart Edge in the chat. Please do be in touch. We're about providing opportunities to exchange ideas, find encouragement and solidarity, and challenge one another as well. We're not a kind of clone factory where we've got a particular template or model that says you've got to be like this, but we are about saying, you know, we are about being at the heart of community, that God is present there, and we find God most closely in the place of margins. So we support the work that happens at the edge, the places written off by those inside or outside. And we want to encourage institutions to subvert the retreat, get back in, because our hunch is this is where God is and the stories are. So there we go. Heart Edge is a movement for renewal of the broad church. Now, I don't know if we've got time for comment or questions. I could just tell you all about St. Germans. There you go. Some of the other lessons that were learned here. Are we going to let go of our building? Are we going to release it in some way? Or do we have to retain some sort of control? They set up a lease agreement that gave them control of one particular, the sanctuary, if you like, in the church. And then the rest of the building was opened up for community use. Who is driving the change? It became a partnership with the local community. So that was all about building relationships. Where did that happen? Local pub. Yeah, so that's probably enough there. The lease agreement I could talk to you about. There are lots of other examples. David, I don't know if you want to.
Thank you very much indeed. If the word inspirational doesn't apply to this, I'm not quite sure where it does apply. That has given us so much to think about, and I think has inspired, will have inspired so much discussion and thought. We're going to go on straight on now to the input from Mill Hill East, and then after that we will have some time for discussion or for dealing with questions. So can I pass over to Josh Kane, please?
Hi everyone, it's great to be with you all. Our input into today is going to take the form of a video that we're going to play, which just visually helps you to see some of what we're talking about, particularly focusing on how we have used our building during COVID, during the past year. So I hope it helps and encourages you, and then I'll be around for discussion and questions afterwards.
In the 1950s, as Britain continued to recover from the trauma and damage of the Second World War, a congregational minister here in Mill Hill asked local residents from the brand new housing estate to help fund a church for the people as part of a Bob a Brick campaign. Today, as our part of North London sees another major phase of house building and redevelopment, I have the joy of being the minister of our community church and of continuing to use our building to help neighbours gather, grow and worship together. Yet, in the last 12 months, all our community groups and programmes came to a stop, and we were no longer able to use our building to gather and to love our neighbours as we had before. We've responded to this challenge in 3 ways. Firstly, just over 3 years ago, we began a project turning some disused land around our building into a community garden. It took a lot of hard work and more fundraising with our neighbours, and it's been really slowly coming together. However, during this time, the outside of our church has become the centre of our community life. Families have learned to grow food, enjoy nature, and have met their neighbours in lots of organic ways. Secondly, we've been using our space to partner with our neighbours, as well as other churches, synagogues and community groups. We were part of a mutual aid group that supported over 200 households with shopping and prescriptions. And we've hosted a phone line for all the vulnerable people in our area to get in touch. We've also started a community food co-op and delivered shopping to families from local schools. Finally, we've had to be creative with how we gather people. Our social enterprise cafe offers employment to vulnerable adults, as well as supporting coffee growers in Tanzania. We moved our coffee bar from the corner of our worship area and put in an outside serving window to create a shop front on our street, continuing the connections with the community and creating a safe environment for our team. Like many other churches, our gatherings have been spread into smaller creative gatherings, and we've used our building to film online services too. The challenges of losing lettings and finance, supporting those unable to access digital church, and dealing with some major roof repairs through the help and generosity of our synod have given me a few more grey hairs. But when we've opened our hearts to God and to our community, we found new ways to love and to grow with the gifts and the resources that we already had. God's generous with things like that.
What we're going to do, I mean, another source of inspiration for us in thinking about what's possible. Let me get my camera in the right place. What we're going to do now is to have some time for 10 minutes or so responding to questions. There are a few questions that have come up on the chat function. There may be some that people would like to put up to ask Andy from Heart Edge or to ask Josh. But we're picking questions up off the chat. So if you've got questions, you can feed them through there. The people answering the questions are, apart from John and Josh and Andy perhaps, but also Cliff and David Skip and Steve Summers as well. It's a kind of a panel approach to questions, but we might also, if necessary, pick on one or two others as appropriate. The first question actually that came up on the chat was one which there may be somebody here who attending who is a better person to answer than any of us, although John's previous experience might give him something to say. And it says, does a new minister's training include the problems and cost of building maintenance as well as the deployment of the premises outside of worship? So it's a ministerial training question. I don't know whether anybody wants to have a stab at that one. Josh, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I am a Baptist minister by trade, but I've also been involved in lecturing and teaching with two different Bible colleges. And I constantly say there should be an alternative Bible college that teaches ministers all the mechanics of chair moving, basic plumbing, crisis electrical work, how to deal with contractors. And I just don't think there is. I think ministers are often given short seminars as part of their training on some of the wider implications of essentially to be a church minister, or to even be a church secretary is to be the CEO of a small charity and manage some quite big assets that maybe have been badly maintained over the years. But there just isn't enough help, I don't think. Someone may be able to speak with more authority for particularly us in as a URC movement as well.
I think you're right, Josh. You know, the difficulty is that it's okay for people like me who have been trained in surveying, perhaps David Tatum too as a QS, and there are a few others who have got building background, but it's always, for me, in the work around the synod, the biggest issue is that the ministers get called in to do things they never ever trained for and never wanted to be involved with. But I see a number of hands going up, so perhaps we ought to look at those. David, I'll leave you to manage that.
Nicola Furley-Smith, I think would like to say something.
I speak as Secretary for Ministries, just to say there is some, but limited, and it would not be about the nitty-gritty of surveying or building. There may be some training, but it'd be nothing in great detail.
Seri.
Hi, I'm a new minister. I have been in post since July last year, so very recently finished training at college. And I would say that the training was, in this particular field, very little.
The Watford group.
Yes, Paul here. We wouldn't expect our minister to do that. That's not what they've been trained to do. And we've got to get out of this habit of expecting ministers to do things like that. It's a partnership between the church elders and the leaders and the minister. And what has been said earlier highlights the need for there to be bigger resources within the church, a bigger church council, to enable this work to be done professionally or by somebody who's skilled in doing it, and not expect our minister to do it. This is where we get the problems, because the ministers haven't got the time and they're not trained.
Thank you. I think we'll move on from that question, except to say that I do remember being minister of one church, and I was the only person who could turn on the lights. We've had, as Father Ted might say, the ecumenical question. A lot of our churches are actually LEPs, and so question stroke comment, it can be a nightmare. This seeming ignorance that's referred to can be a nightmare in LEPs, where both partners are more focused on money for the worship element than anything else. Head count of membership, active or inactive, often creates the difficulty of the active covering for the inactive in M&M costs, and building maintenance suffers. I think it's possibly two questions wrapped up together there, but there is a whole set of questions about our ecumenical partnerships, because a considerable number of our churches are actually in LEPs. And I don't know whether anybody would like to pick up the comment about how their experience perhaps, or how we deal constructively with what can be quite an awkward situation when you're having to take decisions ecumenically as well as just within the URC. Anybody want to comment on that one?
I can see Andrew Atkinson has got his hand up. Is that to answer that question, Andrew? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. A lot of LEPs where they've got a shared building, there's a sharing agreement in place, and there's a management structure for agreeing capital works, but that's very rarely used. You know, there'll often be a joint council set up, but it's something that the church doesn't use, and so when they come to need it, they don't know how to use it.
That is very true, and a lot of the work I do with LEPs, that the joint council only meets when we get to a point where they need to make a decision, and no one really knows how to set that up, and who should attend, and that kind of thing. So it is an issue that does need looking at, and because sharing agreements can vary so much as well.
There is another comment here, and I mean, we're getting to the point where we're actually slightly beyond the point where we're going to go into breakout rooms. So I'm going to perhaps suggest that this one could go back to John Bradbury, maybe to make a kind of, you know, a final comment based on what he's heard. The URC needs some joined up thinking. There needs to be a bigger connection between church growth, walking the way, deployment, and buildings. And whether that triggers anything for John as a kind of parting comment before we go into the breakout rooms.
I think I'd largely say amen to that. It's amazing how difficult we find joined up thinking to do, isn't it? And I think it's so easy to get absorbed in the inbox and the round of responsibilities that we all have, and struggle to keep our heads above water with just what we need to do day by day, to actually find, the headspace and the time to begin to be able to work out how we do that joined up thinking. And I'm not sure that we always structure ourselves in ways that best enables joined up thinking. Sometimes it almost feels like we operate in silos across parts of the church, and anything we can do to try and resist that and join the dots, so that we can absolutely, join up our vocation to mission and evangelism, our human resources, our ministerial resources, our buildings resources, our financial resources, so that we can genuinely make a difference for Christ's sake in different places. We need to do so. Yeah, amen to all of that. But strangely, I wasn't issued with a magic wand when I came into office. Would that I had been.
Thank you, John. Thank you for your input, and thanks for the input from Hart Edge and from Mill Hill East. And thank you in advance for the comments that hopefully are going to emerge out of the breakout rooms that we're going to go into in a moment. But before we do that, I did say right at the beginning that we very much, intend, not only hope, but intend that this is going to be the first of a number of perhaps many regular online conferences and eventually actual conferences in real places with real people, if you like. The planning group, as you're aware, has actually been quite small. We are conscious of the fact that if all four of us were to appear on the screen, we would all look very like one another in many ways. There is a certain lack of diversity of a number of types in our makeup, and perhaps in background and outlook and all kinds of things. We would like to expand the planning, the group, the network, if you like, of people contributing to thinking about future events. If you've got comments or questions, whatever it is you might want to say, you can, of course, email them in. And there will be information up on the Buildings Forum website, and so you'll be able to input stuff there as well. So the important thing is that we want to keep in touch. We want to keep this momentum going, and feed it in, make use of it in whatever way is possible. Simon has just put up on the chat the address, the mission@urc.org.uk, for people to send anything into. So we will end now, and thank you very much for your attendance, your participation, and hope very much to see you again at future events of this. And please do keep in touch. And this is the request to constantly make: send us good stories. We would love to fill the website with good stories, and we never get as much as we would like. So if you've got good stories to share, then do please pass them on. But thank you, and have a good day for the rest of it.